In this lesson, we'll go through an introduction of Exchange Server 2010 Mailbox Server high availability using database availability groups. So let's start with a little bit of history. Back in the Exchange Server 2003 days, we did have clustering available to us, and that was typically Exchange deployed in active-passive clusters as a pair of servers and using shared storage where a single copy of those Exchange databases would sit. Exchange Server 2007 actually brought us 4 separate high availability or replication solutions. They were LCR, which is local continuous replication, SCC, which was single copy clustering, which is very much like Exchange 2003 clustering, CCR, which is cluster continuous replication, and SCR, which could be used in combination with the other 3 to provide a database replica at a completely separate location. So Exchange Server 2010 simplifies the high availability choices for us by giving us just one, which is the database availability group. A database availability group consists of up to 16 Exchange Server 2010 mailbox servers, and each of the members of a database availability group is able to host a different number of mailbox databases depending on the edition of Exchange that you're licensed for. So that's up to 5 databases, whether that's active or passive databases, for the standard edition of Exchange Server 2010, and up to 100 databases, again active or passive, for the Enterprise edition of Exchange Server 2010. And compared to previous versions of Exchange, Exchange Server 2010 and database availability groups give us a number of very significant improvements. The first is that even though it utilizes failover clustering for some of the underlying capabilities, it no longer requires you to pre-configure a cluster before you deploy Exchange. In fact, a lot of the failover clustering functionality is completely abstracted from us. We really never need to go into the failover clustering tools to manage our Exchange 2010 DAGs. Another improvement is the concept of incremental deployment. Now, in previous versions of Exchange, you had to establish your failover cluster first and then install Exchange on top. With Exchange Server 2010, we can take a standalone mailbox server that's already in production, and we can create a DAG and add that server to the DAG without impacting our production services. There's no need to completely rebuild Exchange just because you want to switch from a single server deployment to a multi-server high availability deployment. Another improvement is that the switchover or failover process is now at the per database level. So the previous versions of Exchange, you had to failover the entire clustered mailbox server from one node to another, even if you're only having a problem with a single database. So now with Exchange Server 2010 and database availability groups, we can independently switch over or failover our mailbox databases between different members and do so on that per database basis. And one of the other improvements is that there are now 2 replication modes available for how the transaction log shipping and replay occurs. So previously, all of the transaction log shipping and replay occurred in file mode, which meant that an entire transaction log file had to be written on the active node and then shipped across to the passive node and replayed into the passive database. Now that's still true in Exchange Server 2010 under some conditions. But most of the time, when the databases are almost entirely in sync, the transaction logs replicate in what is known as block mode, which means that as data is written to the transaction log on the active nodes, it is also written to a transaction log copy on the passive nodes at the same time, which means there is a far less chance of data being lost if a failover occurs before a transaction log file has been completely written. As we go through the deployment of a database availability group in our test lab, there's a little bit of terminology that you just need to be familiar with that we'll use over and over again. So once again, a database availability group, or DAG, is the group of up to 16 mailbox servers working together to provide high availability. A DAG member is any one of those mailbox servers that is in the DAG. A star over is a generic term that refers to one of two things. It can either be a switchover, which is a manually initiated move of the active database from one server to another, or it can be a failover, which is an automatically initiated move of a mailbox database from one server to another, for example, when a failure occurs. And a database copy refers to any active or passive mailbox database that resides on a DAG member. We're also going to be configuring DAG networks. Now, a DAG network consists of one or more IP subnets that are connected to the mailbox servers that are members of that DAG. There are two types of DAG networks. The first is the MAPI network, and all DAGs have at least one of these. You might think of this network as the production or the client-facing network. Its IP addresses are registered in DNS, the interfaces are configured with default gateways, and other client settings that you'd normally see on a network interface connected to your production network. Now, in addition to that, we also have replication networks. These are optional, and you can have one or you can have multiple replication networks for a DAG. And basically this is a dedicated network for mailbox database replication traffic to keep it off the MAPI network and basically keep it from saturating your production networks and interfering with client communications. However, it is actually optional. You don't need to deploy one with your DAG. The interfaces that sit on the replication network are not registered in DNS, and they don't have a default gateway configured. If they do need some routing between subnets, then that occurs using static routes. So that's an introduction to database availability groups in Exchange Server 2010. In the next lessons, we'll go through actually deploying a database availability group in our test lab environment.